Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Porous Media Tea Time Talk. It's our 25th session today. So we are part of the Interpor Young Academy, and we give an opportunity to young researchers to broadcast their results to a broad community. So I'm joined here today by my friends Mohammad Nooraiepour from the University of Oslo in Norway, Nara Brandão from the Federal University of Uberlândia in Brazil, and Javier Santos from the University of Texas, the United States. So before we start, I would like to call your attention to a short course from the Interpor Academy that has registration now open. So it's this one here, transport of viruses and colloids in variably saturated porous media. So certainly a very, very important topic these days. And you can register for that one at the website. So it's you just go to interpor.org/short courses and you can register there. So it starts on October 11th. So that is already next Monday, right? Yes. So we are joined today. Our first speaker is Leila Hashemi, and she obtained her master's in reservoir engineering with a focus on pore network modeling. Since 2020, she has been working as a research assistant and then a PhD student at TU Delft on hydrogen energy storage. Today, she will talk about modeling and experimental study of hydrogen transport at microscale in porous media. So Leila, the floor is yours. And I would like to just remind the audience that you can type in questions anytime on YouTube in the comments on the right side, and we'll read the questions to the speakers at the end of the talk. Okay, so Leila, please go ahead.
Thank you. It's my true pleasure and honor to be here. Thanks for the invitation and nice introduction. Today, I'm going to present you our recent papers on both modeling and experimental study of hydrogen transport at microscale in porous media. I am presenting this work today, but of course, I'm not the only one who contributed for this work. So I would like to acknowledge my co-authors and my supervisor and other colleagues here at TU Delft and Professor Martin Blunt from Imperial College of London for their great contribution to this work. First, we will have an introduction on the energy transition and importance of underground hydrogen storage, followed by an overview on existing literature studies and their limitations. Then I will move on to pore network modeling and how we did sensitivity analysis to quantify the uncertainty. And finally, I will show you our experimental results for measuring a static contact angle of hydrogen, brine, and rock. I believe, if not say all of you, but most of you agree the importance of transition to renewable energy sources in order to reduce CO2 emission into atmosphere. But there is a challenge here, because renewable energy sources are naturally intermittent. So to have a sustainable energy supply, we need to store renewable energy when the production is higher than the demand. So how we can store the renewable energies? One of the promising approach is converting them to hydrogen, where we can store hydrogen, and because it has a very high capacity of energy. It has a very high energy capacity. But on the other hand, there is a limitation because hydrogen has a very low density. So we need a giant volumetric capacity to store hydrogen. This is beyond the scope of capacity of any other surface storage facilities. With this, geologists believe that subsurface formation can provide us a giant volumetric capacity for storing hydrogen. And like any other operation in the subsurface, there are several aspects we need to consider, from economic to social, all the way to technical and geological aspect. Here and today, I would like only focus on the hydrodynamic aspect of underground hydrogen storage, where defining capillary pressure and relative permeability in a meaningful way is essential to have a successful reservoir simulation. If we look at the literature, of course, there are several studies what they have done about feasibility study of underground hydrogen storage. For example, in the first paper I mentioned here, they used a Corey-type equation to generate relevant relative permeabilities for hydrogen brine in the porous media. But they did it in the monotonic way without considering that underground hydrogen storage is a cyclic operation. We need to inject and then reclaim back the hydrogen from the subsurface formations. So we need to define the relevant cyclic transport property for that. In the second paper, they did core flooding experiment to generate capillary pressure and relative permeability for hydrogen and brine. They injected hydrogen into a saturated core sample with the reservoir brine, and somehow inversely they calculated contact angle from the capillary pressure curves. And in a couple of slides, I will speak how we did the Porous scale modeling. Regarding the limitation of the literature study, I would like to emphasize that both of those research I mentioned in the previous slide, both of them only consider the first cycle of displacement, which we call it primary drainage, where hydrogen is injected into a reservoir. However, when we want to use a Corey-type equation to get a relative permeability for the hydrogen brine system, we need to define a proper exponent for the both two phases of hydrogen and brine. However, in that study, they didn't distinguish between the wetting and non-wetting phase here. And as I mentioned, there is only one core flooding experiment for a specific reservoir condition. And with the capillary pressure curves, they reported contact angle of the hydrogen and brine in contact with the rock sample about 20 degrees, which correspond to the receding contact angle because they did only drainage cycle where hydrogen is injected into a reservoir. But because of the cyclicity nature of this hydrogen storage in underground, we need to define a proper properties of the hydrogen when we want to produce it. So we need to define the contact angle hysteretic during the production because we would have advancing contact angle for the production cycle. And if we pick up the 20-degree receding contact angle from that core flooding experiment and follow the Morus curve, we will end up about, for the intrinsic contact angle, about 80 degrees, correspond to the advancing contact angle higher than the 90 degree, which represent as the gas-wet system. But it does not make sense physically how hydrogen can change the wettability of the system. So maybe we need to modify the Morus relationship, or we need to define any other relationship for the hysteretic of the contact angle. With that, in our first paper on Porous scale modeling, we did sensitivity analysis with regards to different parameters to quantify the uncertainty in this system. Such as wettability, we defined the range of contact angle of advancing and receding, and to study the effect of the structure of the rock, we either use extracted network from the real rock samples of sandstone and carbonates, and for a specific study of any other parameter of the rock structure, we use a statistical generated network for measuring effect of clay volume percentage and average coordination number represent the connectivity of the system. What we found in our first paper is that in addition to the lack of data in the literature, rock structure and wettability are two effective parameters which can affect on the capillary pressure and relative permeability curves. And with knowing these importance of the input parameter, and of course in the absence of lab data, we established hydrogen lab here at TU Delft. to measure the directly contact angle of hydrogen brine sandstone system using captive bubble method. If you are curious to know how we could measure directly contact angle, I have to explain this setup to you. There is a high pressure and high temperature cell inside this oven, which can provide us a desired temperature. And with this back pressure, we can have a desired pressure in the system. So this is the cross-section of this cell. And here is the schematic of that, or it's an image from the inside the cell. And as you see here, there is a rock sample on the top of the cell, and this cell is filled with water using this pump, and this brine is coming to the cell and fill the cell with the water. And using this gas cylinder and this pump through the gas line, we can inject some bubbles from any gases to the cell. And there is a camera in this cabin connected to this side of the cell and this computer. Then several images are taken from the bubble in different time scale. And with that, for the range of pressure from 20 to 100 bar in the horizontal axis in this graph, you can see range of pressure. We did our experimental test. And here in the vertical axis, you can see the contact angle results for different temperature from 20 to 50 degrees. And for different salinities, here you are seeing only for the 5 kppm NaCl on the Bentheimer sample. And at first we benchmark our setup with nitrogen, then we move on to hydrogen, and we found that the contact angle of the intrinsic contact angle of hydrogen brine and sandstone was between 25 to 45 degrees. However, we did not observe any major sensitivity towards the testing parameter of different pressure, temperature, salinity, and sandstone samples. And with that, I would like to give you some take-home messages from my presentation. First, I want to again emphasize on the importance of defining meaningful capillary pressure and relative permeability to have a successful reservoir simulation, since they are the input parameter for our simulations. So it is crucially important to have a reliable upscale properties, which themselves depends on the porous scale physics. Then with that, we did contact angle measurement of the static contact angle measurement for hydrogen brine and sandstone, and we found that it was completely different than what reported in the literature. They reported 20 degrees of the receiving contact angle for the hydrogen brine, and which correspond to 78 degrees of intrinsic contact angle. However, our result, the average of our results was about 35 degrees. They were completely different, and we did not observe any sensitivity with the range of pressure and temperature and salinity we did our experiment. With that, and if you want to know more details about my presentation, I would like to invite you, please visit our papers. And I would like to thank my teammates and co-authors here in Hydrogen Lab team, and thank all of you for your attention, and I'll be happy to discuss if you have any comments or questions.
Excellent presentation, Leila. Thank you very much. It was very enlightening. It's especially interesting to see someone doing experiments and simulations. So I think you probably have a really good understanding of this phenomenon. And I have a question that's slightly unrelated to the scales you presented here, but I'm curious. I've seen people that are working on molecular dynamic simulations for understanding better these processes. So I'm curious, what do you think? What type of information would you think we can get from those scales to inform your simulations better?
Yeah, of course. Molecular dynamics simulation can be an alternative way to do a study at the Porous scale or at the molecular scale, I would say. With that, we can define proper input parameter for the Porous scale modeling, like contact angle or even interfacial tension. Both of them can be calculated from the molecular dynamics simulations. Actually, I would say there are some ongoing research here at U Delft. Some of my colleagues have some plan to continue the research on that topic. Yeah, of course, it would improve the input parameter for getting better understanding of both two phases of hydrogen and different brine.
Excellent. Thank you for your answer. We have a question from the audience. It's from Sayad, and he's asking about your experimental results. It seems that there's not a lot of variability with respect to either rock type or conditions, but according to him, there's a paper by Iglauer that shows different changes in different conditions. Do you know how we can reconcile both of the results?
Yeah, thank you for this great question and arising this comparison. Actually, yeah, I've seen that paper too, and I can say our work is a bit different. Our experimental approach is a bit different because we are doing a captive bubble cell, which we believe that it's very relevant to the real condition in the subsurface storage. Because in the reality of in the real system, you have a rock surface in contact with the brine. Then you are injecting or introducing hydrogen into your system. However, there is another approach which we call it sessile drop. When there is a surface, it can be rock or even any non-porous sample, then you can have it and fill the cell with any gases you want to do measurements, and then you can inject one droplet of brine into the system, which is vice versa in comparison with what we are doing here. And the other difference with our experiment and what Iglauer's team are doing is that they are using tilted plates method. And then they cannot measure the intrinsic contact angle. They have a tilted surface, and they can measure the dynamic contact angle, which is different than the intrinsic or static contact angle of the hydrogen. Yeah, I think this is the difference, what I can say about our approach or their approach. And these differences can affect on the results. Yeah, I hope it answers the question.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your answer. I don't think we have further questions from the audience at this moment, but feel free to send them to Leila's email address in case you have further concerns. Thank you very much. This was a great presentation. So I would like now to introduce our second speaker. He's Dayo Akindipe. He is currently a PhD student at the University of Wyoming, and his research interests are around CO2 sequestration and the geological processes that happen during this process. In this presentation, he's going to talk to us about salt precipitation in realistic media, in heterogeneous media. And he's going to describe a new mechanism that controls the solute accumulation in reservoirs. Without further ado, Dayo, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. to make this presentation today. I'll be talking about salt precipitation in saline porous media from a pore scale perspective. I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, Dr. Sohail Saraji, and my co-advisor, Dr. Mohammad Piri, for the opportunity to do this work on their collaborative efforts. The outline of this presentation is going to start with an introduction. I would have a short research description. I will discuss some of our exciting results and give my final remarks. As we all know, CO2 has been touted as a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and we see that the atmospheric concentration is at record levels and keeps rising. One way through carbon capture, utilization, and storage is to sequester CO2 geologically in saline aquifers and depleted oil and gas reservoirs. So one of the issues that have come up in pilot studies is near wellbore salt precipitation, such that we have a salt accumulation which leads to loss of injectivity, well injectivity as we inject CO2. Evaporative drying is a main principle, that describes precipitation from aqueous media. It's characterized by three main periods. The constant rate period, where we have a fairly constant, as we see here on the plot on the right, a fairly constant rate period of constant evaporation. And then we have a drop in evaporation, and then we have a falling rate period where we begin to see a frontal advancement of solute into the medium and towards the outlet. And in terms of subsurface saline media, which I'll be talking about today, from the literature review by Miriam Hellevang, they outlined three distinct zones. Zone 1 is a dried out zone where you have lots of precipitates coming up, and then in between that zone and the unsaturated flow zone, we have salt, and we also have some CO2 and brine in the mix. So we essentially have multi-phase flow. And then we have the unsaturated zone, which contains 100% brine. And these zones are separated by an evaporation front and a flooding front. To describe this research work that we did, we wanted to answer a couple of questions, especially relating to salt precipitation in naturally occurring porous media. First, how does it occur in this media? What is the extent of change in pore morphology? What are the most likely precipitation sites? What's the effect of CO2 on injection rate? And how does heterogeneity affect the dynamics of precipitation? And so we carried out a series of core flooding. We call them here the miniature core flooding experiments, such that we inject fluids into a small core sample, could be as small as 5 millimeters in diameter, and at high pressure and temperature, using micro CT imaging, and as well as FIPSIM imaging after we get our results. I did the experiments with two main materials, a Klashak sandstone sample and a prairie shell limestone sample. The Klashak sample is majorly quartz with some feldspar and a little bit of some clay minerals. It's one of the cleaner sandstones out there. And then I did also the experiments with prairie shell limestone, mostly as we can see, mostly calcite with some intragranular and intergranular micropores. And the brine system was sodium iodide, so a sodium iodide solution about 250,000 ppm salinity. And the CO2 was applied as liquid, but we heated and pressurized it to supercritical state. 3 core-filling experiments were done so the 2 carbonates were done at 2 different rates, and 1 sandstone experiment and the imaging was done at high resolution, about 2 microns. And the core flooding sequence was we first vacuumed the core sample, and then introduced brine to have 100% brine saturated medium, and then we injected CO2 as a primary drainage injection at a certain rate to serve as a baseline for our dry out sequence. And sequentially, we injected CO2 at different time intervals. So first, after injecting the first stage of CO2 for primary drainage, as we know, once CO2 invades the system, it mostly occupies the centers of larger medium-sized pores because of the wetting order. We believe that water, as we can see in the images, water is more wetting than CO2. So CO2 will occupy the centers and move water to the corners, the sharp corners and the crevices of these pores. Also, we noticed that many of the larger pores were not also invaded by the CO2 at the 0.1 centimeter cube per minute injection rate. This was followed by a sequence of hourly injections. So within the first 12 hours of our dry out sequence, we did not see any significant change in the pore fluid occupancy. Mostly the CO2 kind of, the system kind of reached a plateau. And but as we continue to the 24th hour, we see here that the CO2 was able to invade some pores at the top of this 24-hour image. And so it begins to give us a clue as to, okay, what is happening? And we thought we had gotten to a plateau. And then going on to the 24th hour, we even see a more significant finding, I would say. We see that the brine has probably disappeared, or it has reduced in intensity to as low as the grain. And we were trying to scratch our heads and see what's going on here. So we continued even to the next hour, the process which I would describe as reverse solute diffusion. So let's see how this goes. So first, we had this 48-hour image where the brine intensity was same as a rock, basically reduced. And so if you look at what we did, we only imaged the field of view. So we had a field of view at the center of the core sample, CO2 being injected from the top. And this is what we initially inferred, which I will actually confirm later on. First, as we know from the literature, salt starts to precipitate from the top, from the entry surface of the sample. And so we see that an evaporation front is actually moving from the top of the sample towards the bottom. So as this is happening, solutes are being drawn towards this evaporation front from our field of view that we have here. So as these solutes are being drawn towards the front, we see a drop or a reduction in the concentration of the solutes below the front. So this creates a concentration gradient, which we will see later on in our 60th hour image. But going back to the literature, in the literature, they describe this as more or less the brine itself being drawn by capillary action towards the evaporating front, and not necessarily the solute. But we observed solute being drawn within the connected brine phase towards this front. And this gives us a really huge clue as to what is actually going on. So we're here at the 60th hour image, and the red line drawn here is where we believe the front was. And above the front, we have mostly salt, and below we have a concentration gradient of brine. As we can see here, the brine begins to reappear and forms a concentration gradient down the field of view. And this confirms what we inferred earlier, the 48-hour image, where the solutes are being drawn to a moving, evaporating front. And at the 72nd hour, we see that brine had fully precipitated within the field of view. It's possible that even throughout the core sample, brine may not have precipitated, as we can see on the image, but within the field of view, brine had fully precipitated. And so this is a general overview of the reverse solute diffusion process that we figured out eventually. And so what is the effect of injection rate on salt precipitation? We observed that comparing the two carbonate samples, it affects the time to precipitation, basically, and it also affects the eventual salt saturation. So less time, less salt. And that why is that happening? At the first stage that I mentioned, the advection dominated flow, CO2 is better able to displace brine, and of course, if you had less brine in the system before precipitation occurs, you would have less salt being precipitated out. We try to compare the cluster size distribution to related to the injection rate, but we found out that the cluster size distribution was invariant of injection rate. So mostly the salt precipitates that formed were medium-sized clusters within a range of 5 × 10⁻⁶ to 1 × 10⁻³ millimeter cube. And for both systems, there was no big difference in salt cluster size. So we concluded here that the cluster size is invariant of whatever injection rate that we have. We observed precipitation in the micropores, both in the carbonate and the sandstone sample. For the sandstone sample, the salt precipitated mostly in the clay-bearing clay mineral, within the clay minerals, basically, as we can see on the image with the red rings. A lot of salt precipitated out in these areas. And and for the carbonate, we see salt precipitating within intrafossil or intragranular micropores. And to zoom in specifically for the carbonates, we see an intragranular deposition of salts here that's between two carbonate grains. And at the bottom image, this is an intragranular deposition where we have salt depositing within in fissures within a certain carbonate grain. And if we account for the effect of micropores, we see a larger difference in salt saturation in the sandstone compared to the carbonate. We believe that this happened because the clay-bearing minerals tend to absorb more of this aqueous solution better than, for example, just having some micropores within the grains, for example. So we believe that this salt precipitated out of the sandstone sample was actually much more intense in the micropores in the sandstone compared to the carbonate. The overall effect of salt precipitation is porosity reduction. Comparing across carbonates to sandstone, we see a more uniform porosity change in the sandstone, relating to the fact that the sandstone sample on the whole are more homogeneous compared to the carbonate system. And so finally, so to recap all I've said today, we've outlined 3 stages of evaporative drying in real reservoir systems. The first stage is an advection-dominated transport, where you have CO2 displacing brine to the extent of the pressure drop within the system. And then we have a transition stage where I describe the reverse solute diffusion mechanism that helps to insert solute accumulation at the moving evaporation front. And finally, solute accumulation at the front causes the diffusion, controlled evaporation, and eventual precipitation at the front. And the final salt precipitation is limited by the medium precipitation in medium-sized pores, such that we have mostly medium-sized clusters. And higher injection rate actually helps to reduce the effect. So in the field applications, for example, if it's possible, it's better to go at a higher injection, well, as high as possible, because someone asks how high, really. And then the microporous media actually have significant contributions. So in terms of reservoir simulation, they need to be accounted for. Thank you very much. And I would like to say that if you have any further, interest in my work, it's published in the Advances in Water Resources Journal. And I'd like to acknowledge the sponsorship of Thermo Fisher Scientific, the Hess Corporation, and the School of Energy Resources in the University of Wyoming for this work. And I'm really grateful to the Interpro Academy and the Porous Media Team Time Talk team for the opportunity to give this presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dayo. It was a really interesting presentation. I've been doing CO2-induced salt precipitation studies, experiments, modeling for a couple of years, and it was a really great piece of work you've done here.
Thank you very much.
Interesting results and lots of important implications. Well done.
Thank you.
We have a question from Kofi. Can this CO2 crystallization be conducted above ground to generate valuable minerals for industry, for example, food, drug, construction? If so, what would need to be considered? Purity of CO2, cation species, and something like that.
Yes, I think it's more or less talking about mineralization of maybe carbonates. Yes, it's I think from what I've read in the literature, it's more of energy that is the problem. It's quite energy intensive, it can be done, of course, because this is also applicable in soil salinization, for example, at the surface. It's more or less you're basically injecting CO2 at the surface, maybe perpendicular to the surface, to induce that precipitation, that drawing of solutes from the porous media or whatever media that you have towards the evaporating surface.
Interesting. We have another question from Gulse. Thank you very much for the excellent talk. Have you encountered any difficulty to segment solid salt and brine phases for the images belong to the transition stage?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a slide. Let me show. Here. So this was a major issue. So trying to figure out the difference between this brine, the brine 1 and brine 2. How do I? So I used a machine learning algorithm supplied to us by Thermo Fisher Scientific to actually detect. So I basically gave a intensity range for brine 1. I had to. And then brine 2. So it was able to detect the two different brine phases, as you see here in the segmentation. So yeah, it's conventional, maybe interactive or overlay thresholding, or even sometimes watershed segmentation may not really suffice for this.
And this machine learning technique, is it part of Aviso or ProGeos?
ProGeos, yes.
As a final question, I have a question of my own. This reverse solute diffusion, how can it be mixed with the self-enhancing characteristics of salt precipitation, and then how we should update clogging models for the salts?
Yes, I believe Miri and Hellevan talked about the self-enhancement, which actually gave us a clue as to what was happening. Thanks to them, they inferred something called surface tension, a surface tension force that enhances it. And actually that is true. In the literature, it's emphasized that at the front, we have a higher surface tension at the front. That's the surface tension between the CO2 and the brine. So that higher surface tension at the front relative to below the front helps in that solute, drawing the solute. So it serves as a driving force for solute diffusion toward, because actually, of course, we should not have movement of solute from a lower to high. It should be higher to lower normal diffusion, and that's why we called it reverse solute diffusion. So that tension at the surface, at the evaporating front, actually draws solutes towards it. So in terms of modeling, I believe you should impose that higher surface tension at the front. It's probably going to be a bit complex because the front is moving. You have to update it has to update itself, as the front is moving, the surface tension. So yeah, but it's possible.
And the last question from Julio: great presentation. For long-time CO2 injection, considering salt precipitation, what do you suggest as prevention technique to solve such an issue?
Yeah, so in the field, in the field here, in the Snovit field, they actually injected a mixture of methyl ethyl glycol and water. So normally you would think that, I just need to inject maybe very probably deionized or distilled water or something, which of course is quite expensive. So they had to mix methyl ethyl glycol, which I believe is a better solvent even than water for these salts.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dayo, for the presentation and for the discussion.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
It's our pleasure. And now we can wrap up this session. We went a bit of more than expected for our talks. We usually try to finish it under 40 minutes, but we are a bit more than that today. Now it's time to announce the speakers for the next session. In 2 weeks, we will host San Lee and Mahdi Mansouri with 2 diverse talks on pore scale origins of flow-induced bioaggregation and also pore invasion dynamics in transition from viscous to capillary flow regimes during drainage in porous media. With that, I would like to thank you for joining us today, and please feel free to give us feedback and try to help us make this platform better for PhDs and early career researchers. With that, I would like to thank you and have a nice day. Ciao.